Leather squealed under Samuel's weight as he shifted in the wingback chair. It was a subtle, grating sound that seemed to echo too loudly against the mahogany-paneled walls of Arthur Mitchell's law office. The air in the room was stifling, heavy with the smell of lemon furniture polish and the stale, burnt acorn scent of coffee sitting in a French press on the credenza. Samuel adjusted his tie, his fingers brushing against the silk. He had chosen the red one today, a power color, a subtle psychological flex for what was supposed to be a bloodbath. He had spent the last 6 months preparing for war, stockpiling financial records, moving liquid assets into opaque trusts, and paying Arthur an obscene hourly rate to draft counterclaims that would bury his soon-to-be ex-wife in a blizzard of paperwork. He had expected shouting. He had expected tears. He had expected her to fight tooth and nail for the house in Aspen, the stock options, the cars, the life he had built while she quietly faded into the background of their 15-year marriage. Instead, Nora sat across from him, perfectly still. She wore a beige wool coat that smelled faintly of damp outside air and peppermint. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture rigid but relaxed, like someone waiting for a delayed train. She wasn't looking at Samuel. She wasn't even looking at Arthur. Her pale blue eyes were fixed on the silver staple biting into the corner of the thick stack of paper resting on the glass-topped desk between them. "I want to be absolutely certain we are all understanding the terms here," Arthur said. His voice was a dry, papery rasp. He cleared his throat, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He looked deeply uncomfortable, a man used to refereeing cage matches, suddenly finding himself officiating a silent retreat. "Nora, your counsel isn't present. I strongly advised you." "I fired him yesterday," Nora said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the tremor Samuel had spent half a decade trying to diagnose and fix. "I don't need him to read what I already know." Arthur sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. He pulled a Mont Blanc pen from his breast pocket, the gold trim catching the muted gray light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. "Very well. Let the record reflect that Nora Caldwell is proceeding pro se in this final mediation. I will read the stipulations one last time." Samuel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He felt a strange, tight knot forming just beneath his sternum. It wasn't guilt. It was paranoia. "Regarding the marital estate," Arthur began, tracing the lines of text with the cap of his pen. "The petitioner, Nora Caldwell, waives all rights to spousal support. She waives any and all claims to the primary residence in Seattle. She waives her right to the vacation property in Aspen. She relinquishes any claim to the shared investment portfolios held under Caldwell Industries and agrees to a full and complete separation of assets, taking only the balance of her personal checking account." Arthur stopped. The silence in the room rushed back in, thick and suffocating. Outside, the muffled drone of traffic crawled along the wet asphalt of the city. "Nothing," Samuel said. The word tasted dry in his mouth. Arthur looked up. "Excuse me." "She's asking for nothing." Samuel stared at Nora, searching the side of her face for a tell, a twitch in her jaw, a tightening of her lips, anything. "No alimony, no equity. After 15 years, you're just walking out with the clothes on your back?" Nora finally turned her head. Her face was a mask of polite indifference, the kind of look you give a stranger who bumps into you at the grocery store. "I am taking what is mine, Samuel. I don't want anything of yours." Samuel felt a sudden, hot rush of blood to his face. It was the insult of it. He had built Caldwell Medical Solutions from a two-man garage operation into a $40 million titan of precision manufacturing. He had poured his blood, his sleep, his sanity into that company. He had sacrificed their marriage on the altar of his ambition, justifying it every step of the way because he was building an empire for them. And now she was treating his empire like it was toxic waste. She didn't even think it was worth fighting for. A laugh bubbled up in his throat. He tried to swallow it, but it broke free. A short, harsh barking sound that cracked like a gunshot in the quiet office. Arthur flinched. Nora didn't blink. "You're kidding," Samuel chuckled, shaking his head. He leaned back in his chair, suddenly feeling light, giddy with the sheer absurdity of it. All that anxiety, all those billable hours. You're just giving up, just like that. The great Nora Caldwell, folding a winning hand because it's too much effort to play the cards. "Samuel, please," Arthur muttered, rubbing his temples. No, let's be honest here," Samuel said, his voice rising, filling the room with his sudden surge of bravado. He pointed a finger at her. "You couldn't handle the pressure of the business when we were together, and you can't even handle the pressure of taking half of it now. You want to walk away with nothing? Fine, that's your choice. But don't pretend it's some noble sacrifice. You're just taking the easy way out, like always." Nora reached out, her pale, slender fingers wrapping around the thick barrel of the Mont Blanc pen Arthur had placed on the desk. She didn't rise to the bait. She didn't defend herself. She just pulled the document toward her, the paper scraping softly against the glass. "Where do I sign?" she asked Arthur. Arthur pointed to a line at the bottom of page 32. "Here, and initial the next 3 pages." The scratch of the gold nib against the heavy stock paper was the only sound for a long, agonizing minute. Samuel watched her hand move. Fluid, steady, no hesitation. She initialed the pages, flipped to the final decree, and signed her name with a sharp, aggressive flourish that seemed entirely out of character for the quiet woman sitting there. She placed the pen down. It rolled slightly, clinking against a crystal paperweight. Nora stood up. She smoothed the front of her coat, buttoned the top button, and looked at Samuel one last time. There was no sadness in her eyes, no anger, just a terrifying, hollow finality. "Goodbye, Samuel," she said. She turned and walked out of the office. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind her with a soft, definitive thud. The scent of peppermint lingered in the air for a moment, then vanished, swallowed by the smell of Arthur's stale coffee. Samuel looked at the signed document. He had won. He had kept everything. He was a wealthy, unencumbered man. So why did his hands feel numb? And why did the silence she left behind feel less like peace and more like the pulling of a pin from a grenade? The house in Seattle was 6,000 square feet of glass, steel, and imported Italian marble. When Samuel walked through the front door that evening, the smart home system detected his fob and brought the lights up to a welcoming warm amber. The climate control hummed softly, keeping the air at exactly 70 degrees. It was perfect. It was flawless. It was completely dead. He dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the door. The clatter shattered the quiet, ringing down the long, empty hallway. He stood there in the foyer, listening to the silence. He had expected to feel a sense of liberation. No more arguments about his travel schedule. No more finding her reading in his study, Her quiet presence, a constant nagging reminder of his emotional absenteeism. The space was entirely his now. He walked into the kitchen, his leather shoes tapping a hollow rhythm on the tile. He poured himself a measure of Macallan 18, the heavy crystal tumbler cool against his palm. He took a sip, letting the peat and alcohol burn the back of his throat. She asked for nothing. The thought kept looping in his mind, a persistent mosquito buzzing in his ear. It defied logic. He knew Nora wasn't independently wealthy. She had been an adjunct professor of linguistics when they met, a job she quit a decade ago to manage their home life as his business demanded more and more of his time. She had a modest savings account. How was she going to live? Why would she willingly step off a cliff into financial ruin? Samuel shook his head, downing the rest of the scotch. Not my problem anymore, he told himself. She made her bed. The next morning, the phantom weight of the divorce was entirely eclipsed by the visceral reality of Caldwell Medical Solutions. Walking onto the factory floor was Samuel's religion. He loved the smell of the place, a sharp, industrial cocktail of ozone, machine coolant, and hot metal. He loved the whining roar of the 5-axis CNC machines, chewing through blocks of medical-grade titanium, turning raw elements into the intricate life-saving cardiovascular valves that had made him a multimillionaire. Here, everything made sense. Here, he was in control. Every machine, every worker, every micromillimeter of tolerance was dictated by his vision. He climbed the steel stairs to the glass-walled executive offices overlooking the floor, feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline. He swiped his badge, pushed through the double doors, and walked into his suite. Greg, his CFO, was already there. Greg was a man who permanently looked like he had just swallowed a lemon. He was brilliant with numbers, but possessed the nervous system of a frightened chihuahua. Today, Greg looked worse than usual. His tie was crooked, his thin hair was rumpled, and he was staring at a single piece of paper resting on Samuel's desk as if it were radioactive. "Morning, Greg," Samuel said, shrugging off his suit jacket and draping it over the back of his chair. He glanced at the paper, but didn't pick it up. "You look like you slept in a ditch. What's the crisis today? Supply chain hiccups? Did the Germans delay the steel shipment again?" Greg swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. "No, Samuel, it's not the Germans." He pointed a shaking finger at the paper. "It's Apex." Samuel frowned, sinking into his leather chair. He pulled the paper toward him. "Apex Holdings? The licensing shell? What do they want? It's just a standard renewal year. Send them their check." "They didn't send a renewal invoice," Greg said, his voice barely a whisper. "They sent a notice of termination." Samuel froze. The ambient hum of the factory floor filtering through the glass suddenly felt very far away. He picked up the letter. It was printed on heavy, cream-colored stock, bearing a stark, minimalist letterhead. The text was brief, steeped in dense legalese, but the bottom line was glaringly clear. Apex Holdings, LLC, hereby declines the option to renew the exclusive licensing agreement for U.S. patent number 8,452,119. Per the terms of the original 10-year contract, Caldwell Medical Solutions must cease all manufacturing, marketing, and distribution of products utilizing the patented microvalve architecture within 30 days of this notice. Samuel read the paragraph 3 times. The words seemed to blur together, refusing to compute. "They can't do this," Samuel snapped, slamming the paper onto the desk. "We've leased that patent for 10 years. It's the core architecture of our entire cardiac line. It's 80% of our revenue." "I know what it is, Samuel," Greg pleaded, running a hand over his face. "But the original contract was a 10-year lease with an option to renew upon mutual agreement. They aren't agreeing. They're pulling the license." Samuel's mind raced, trying to find the angle. He remembered signing the initial lease a decade ago. Back then, Caldwell Medical was struggling. He needed a specific microvalve design to make his machines viable. His lawyers found a dormant patent owned by an anonymous holding company called Apex. They offered a lease, and Samuel took it because he couldn't afford to buy the patent outright. Over the years, that leased architecture became the foundation of his empire. He had thrown millions into upgrading the manufacturing process around it, assuming the anonymous owners of Apex would happily keep cashing their licensing checks forever. "Why?" Samuel demanded, his pulse beginning to hammer against his collar. "Do they want more money? Is this a shakedown? Because if it is, tell them we'll double the licensing fee. Triple it even. Just get it done." "I tried," Greg said miserably. "I've been calling their registered agent in Delaware since 6 a.m. The agent won't connect me to the principals. They just keep reading from a script. Apex Holdings has chosen to take the IP in a different direction. That's it. They won't negotiate." "Everyone negotiates," Samuel growled. He stood up, pacing behind his desk. The smug satisfaction he had felt leaving the lawyer's office yesterday evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp spike of genuine panic. If he couldn't use that patent, his factory was just a warehouse full of very expensive, very useless metal cutting machines. His contracts with the hospitals would default. The company would bleed out in months. "Find out who owns Apex," Samuel ordered, leaning over the desk, his eyes locking onto Greg's terrified face. "Pierce the corporate veil, hire private investigators, hire forensic accountants. I don't care what it costs. Find the name of the person sitting at the top of that holding company and get them on the phone with me by the end of the week. I'll make them an offer they can't refuse. I'm going to buy the damn patent outright." Greg nodded frantically, gathering up his tablet. "I'm on it. I'll call the legal team." As Greg scurried out of the office, Samuel looked down at the cream-colored letter again. The paper was thick, expensive. He reached out and touched the edge of it. A strange, phantom smell brushed past his nose, something cool and sharp. He dismissed it instantly, blaming the stress. He looked out the glass window at his factory floor. The machines were still screaming, grinding titanium into gold. But for the first time in 10 years, Samuel looked at his empire and realized the foundation was built on rented ground. And the landlord had just changed the locks. 4 days passed. They were the longest 4 days of Samuel's professional life. The forensic accountants hit a brick wall. The private investigators hit a brick wall. Apex Holdings was a ghost ship sailing through the loopholes of Delaware corporate law. It was a single-member LLC, layered behind 2 offshore trusts and managed by a proxy law firm that specialized in absolute anonymity. There were no public filings with names, no social media footprints, no rogue emails to intercept, just a post office box in Wilmington and a bank account that automatically swept funds into the ether. Samuel wasn't sleeping. The dark circles under his eyes looked like bruises. His meticulously tailored suits felt loose, hanging off his shoulders as his appetite vanished. The smell of the factory floor, once his favorite scent in the world, now made his stomach churn with nausea. He was a captain watching the water rise in the hull, unable to find the leak. It was a Thursday afternoon, raining again, a relentless, depressing Seattle drizzle, when his phone buzzed on the desk. He snatched it up, hoping to see Greg's name. It was Arthur Mitchell, his divorce lawyer. Samuel let out a harsh breath of annoyance. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Arthur, I cannot deal with paperwork right now. The divorce is finalized. File whatever you need to file and bill my office." "Samuel," Arthur's voice came through the speaker. It didn't sound like his usual dry, professional self. It sounded thin, strained, like a man standing on the edge of a very high cliff. "You need to come down to my office, right now." "I'm in the middle of a corporate crisis, Arthur. I don't have time for—" "This is about the crisis, Samuel," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made the hairs on Samuel's arms stand up. "Greg called me. He asked me to pull some strings with a federal judge I know to see if we could get a subpoena to unseal the ownership records of Apex Holdings based on a suspicion of corporate sabotage." Samuel gripped the edge of his desk. His knuckles turned white. "And? Did you get the subpoena?" "I didn't need to," Arthur said. The silence on the line stretched out for an agonizing second. "The records unsealed themselves this morning, automatically. You need to come down here. You need to see this in person." 30 minutes later, Samuel was driving his Porsche through the slick, rain-drenched streets downtown. The wipers squeaked against the glass. Thwack, squeak, thwack, squeak. A rhythmic grating sound that clawed at his frayed nerves. His chest felt tight, bound by bands of iron. He didn't bother with the umbrella when he parked. He walked through the rain, letting the cold water soak his shoulders, and took the elevator up to the 40th floor. The law office still smelled like lemon polish and old paper, but the atmosphere had shifted. The receptionist didn't offer him coffee. She just gave him a wide, nervous look and pointed toward Arthur's door. Samuel pushed the heavy oak door open without knocking. Arthur was sitting behind his desk. He looked 10 years older than he had 4 days ago. Beside his elbow sat a bottle of liquid antacid, the cap unscrewed. On the center of the glass-topped desk lay a single manila folder. Samuel stripped off his wet coat, throwing it over the wingback chair, the same chair he had sat in when he laughed at his wife. He walked up to the desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Tell me," Samuel demanded, his voice rough. "Who owns it? Who is the holding company? Is it a competitor? Did MedTech buy them out to sink me?" Arthur looked up, his eyes bloodshot behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He didn't speak. He just reached out with a trembling hand and opened the manila folder. "Delaware law allows for absolute anonymity in single-member LLCs," Arthur said slowly, his voice sounding hollow, as if he were reciting a eulogy. "As long as the LLC is held by a marital trust, the controlling member's identity can be shielded by the trust's confidentiality clauses. It's an ironclad veil." "I don't care about the law, Arthur. I care about the name," Samuel shouted, slamming his hand on the desk. The crystal paperweight rattled. Arthur didn't flinch. He just stared at the document inside the folder. "The veil only breaks under specific conditions. One of those conditions is the dissolution of the marital trust. When a marriage ends and the assets are permanently separated, the trust holding the LLC is forced to dissolve and transfer ownership to the individual beneficiary. The state requires the transfer to be recorded, publicly." A cold prickle of dread started at the base of Samuel's spine. It crawled up his back, raising the hairs on his neck. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. "What are you saying?" Samuel whispered. The aggression bled out of him, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vertigo. Arthur slowly rotated the folder so it faced Samuel. "I'm saying, Samuel, that the only reason Apex Holdings was unsealed today is because 4 days ago, sitting in that exact chair, you signed a legally binding document finalizing the separation of your marital assets." Arthur swallowed hard. "And in doing so, you officially cleared the owner of Apex Holdings of any conflict of interest regarding Caldwell Medical Solutions." Samuel's eyes dropped to the paper. It was a standard state of Delaware transfer of ownership form. The legal jargon blurred together, a wall of meaningless text, until his eyes locked onto the bolded lines at the bottom of the page. Transferring entity: the Caldwell Blind Marital Trust. Receiving member and sole proprietor: Nora Caldwell. Samuel stopped breathing. The hum of the city outside vanished. The ticking of his expensive watch went silent. The world contracted until it was nothing but the black ink on the white page. "Nora. She leased the patent to you 10 years ago," Arthur said softly, his voice cutting through the ringing in Samuel's ears. "She bought it cheap when she was still teaching, before you incorporated. She hid it in a trust to protect you from liability if the company went under. She's been your landlord this entire time." Samuel staggered back a step. His legs felt like lead. He looked at the wingback chair, remembering the way she had sat there. The beige coat, the faint smell of peppermint, the hollow, terrifying finality in her eyes. "I am taking what is mine, Samuel. I don't want anything of yours." She hadn't asked for nothing because she was weak. She hadn't walked away because she was intimidated by his wealth. She had walked away, refusing alimony, refusing his cars, refusing his house, to ensure the divorce went through as fast and as cleanly as possible. She gave up the battle because she had already won the war. She didn't want half his company. She owned the ground it was built on, and she was burning it to the ash. Rain drummed a chaotic, arrhythmic beat against the roof of the Porsche. Samuel sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, the air inside the cabin growing cold and damp. He stared through the water-streaked windshield at the blurred neon lights of downtown Seattle, but his eyes weren't tracking anything. His hands rested on the steering wheel, fingers rigidly gripping the smooth leather. It felt alien beneath his skin. Everything felt alien. 10 years. He traced the timeline backward, sifting through the wreckage of his own memory. 2014. They were living in a cramped, drafty duplex near the university. He was maxing out their joint credit cards, sweating through his shirts, trying to make payroll for his 2 engineers. Nora was grading undergraduate linguistics papers at a wobbly kitchen table, wrapped in a fleece blanket because they couldn't afford to keep the heat above 65. He remembered complaining to her, pacing the worn carpet, agonizing over the licensing fees for a dormant microvalve patent his lawyers had found. He had cursed the faceless corporate leeches at Apex Holdings, furious that they wouldn't lower their rates for a struggling startup. He remembered Nora listening quietly, pouring him cheap drip coffee, her eyes unreadable over the rim of her mug. She was the leech. A wave of nausea hit him, sudden and violent. A sour, metallic taste pooled at the back of his throat. He swallowed hard, fumbling in his pocket for his phone. His fingers felt thick, clumsy. He dialed Greg's number. "Greg," Samuel rasped, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over gravel. The wire transfer, the final settlement payout to Nora's personal account. Where did it go? Did she change her banking details? Samuel, it's past 7. Pull the goddamn file, Greg, Samuel barked, the sound explosive in the tight confines of the car. He panted, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. Just give me the address attached to the routing number. 2 minutes later, Samuel turned the ignition key. The engine roared to life, a deep, guttural growl that usually brought him a sense of immense satisfaction. Tonight, it just sounded like machinery. Stupid, loud machinery. He drove toward Ballard. He left the towering glass spires of the financial district behind, navigating into a neighborhood of transitioning industrial zones and older residential blocks. The rain was coming down harder now, washing the streets in a slick, oily sheen. He parked half on the curb outside a 3-story brick walk-up. It was a building that hadn't seen a renovation since the mid-90s. The paint around the window frames was peeling in thick, curled scabs. There was no doorman, no marble foyer, just a battered call box missing half its buttons. Samuel stepped out into the downpour. He didn't bother with his coat. The cold water soaked through his expensive suit jacket instantly, plastering the Italian wool to his shoulders. He yanked the heavy front door open. The lock was broken. The hallway smelled like old drywall, boiled onions, and wet dog. The linoleum floor was scuffed with decades of rubber soles. Samuel's leather wingtips squeaked aggressively with every step he took up the narrow, dimly lit stairwell. The sound scraped against his exposed nerves. How could she live here? The woman who had access to millions of dollars in licensing fees. The woman who had just walked away from half of a $40 million empire. She was hiding in a place that smelled like poverty and floor wax. He reached the 3rd floor. Apartment 3B. The door was painted a dull, institutional green. The brass numbers were tarnished. Samuel stood there for a long moment, the water dripping from his chin onto his soaked collar. His chest heaved. He raised his hand, curling his fingers into a tight fist. His knuckles were raw, trembling. He knocked. It wasn't a polite tap. It was a flat, heavy thud that rattled the cheap wood in its frame. Silence answered him. A radiator hissed somewhere down the hall. He raised his fist to pound again, but the lock clicked. The door opened with a slow, agonizing whine of poorly oiled hinges. Nora stood in the doorway. She wasn't wearing the beige wool coat or the polite mask of indifference she had worn at Arthur's office. She wore a bulky, faded gray sweater that swallowed her frame in a pair of worn leggings. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy, haphazard knot. She held a ceramic mug in both hands. She didn't gasp. She didn't look afraid. She just looked tired and vaguely annoyed, like he was a door-to-door salesman interrupting her evening. "You're dripping on the floorboards, Samuel," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. The smell of bergamot and hot dust drifted out from the apartment, hitting him in the face. It was such a domestic, aggressively normal scent that it completely short-circuited his brain. "Apex," Samuel breathed out. The word tore at his throat, a jagged piece of glass. "It was you." Nora stepped back, leaving the door open. "Come in and shut the door. You're letting the heat out." Samuel stepped over the threshold, his wet shoes leaving dark, smeared footprints on the cheap laminate flooring. He pushed the door shut behind him. The click of the latch sounded terrifyingly final in the quiet room. The apartment was tiny, claustrophobic. Every available surface was covered in books, heavy, cloth-bound volumes on syntax, phonology, and historical linguistics. They were stacked on the floor, piled on the second-hand sofa, stacked precariously on a small Formica dining table. A single radiator clanked and hissed in the corner, radiating a suffocating dry heat. Nora walked into the cramped kitchen alcove. She set her mug down on the counter. It made a dull, heavy thwack. "Arthur called you," she said, keeping her back to him as she leaned against the counter. "Why?" Samuel demanded. He stepped forward, trying to use his height, his physical presence, to fill the room and force her to shrink. It was an old intimidation tactic he used in boardrooms. It failed completely. Nora didn't even turn around. "Which part, Samuel?" she asked quietly. "Why did I buy it? Or why did I take it back?" "Both! All of it!" he shouted, the restraint finally snapping. His voice bounced off the low ceiling, harsh and ugly. 10 years, Nora! You sat across from me at the dinner table for 10 years, watching me sweat over licensing fees, watching me build the entire manufacturing process around that IP, and you were cashing the checks? You were my goddamn landlord? Nora finally turned. Her pale blue eyes caught the dim yellow light from the overhead fixture. They were calm, terrifyingly calm. "I bought the patent in 2014, she said, her tone as clinical as a professor delivering a lecture. "You were drowning. The bank was threatening to call in your business loans. You needed that micro-valve design, but the original holding company went bankrupt and the IP was locked in probate. You couldn't afford the legal fees to extract it." Samuel stared at her, his jaw tight. "So you swooped in behind my back." "I cashed out my grandfather's inheritance," she corrected, her voice hardening just a fraction. "The money I was saving for a down payment on a house. I bought the patent through a proxy lawyer. I set up the blind trust. I leased it back to Caldwell Medical for a quarter of the market rate. You lied to me." "I shielded you," she fired back, taking a single step toward him. "If Caldwell Medical went under, which, need I remind you, was a very real possibility for 3 years, the creditors would have stripped you down to the copper wiring. But they couldn't touch the patent. It was safe in the trust. If you lost the company, you could have started over. I built a safety net, Samuel, out of my own pocket." Samuel shook his head, struggling to process the information. It didn't fit the narrative he had written for his life. He was the self-made man. He was the savior. She was the dependent. Then why didn't you tell me? When we went public, when the money started coming in, why hide it? Nora looked away, her gaze drifting toward the rain lashing against the small window. The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of 1,000 unspoken arguments. "I was going to," she said softly. "Our 5th anniversary, we went to Carmel. I brought the trust documents in my suitcase. I had this whole speech planned about how we were finally partners, how we owned our destiny outright." Samuel swallowed. He remembered that trip. He had spent 4 days on the balcony of their suite, screaming into his cell phone at a supply chain manager, while Nora sat alone on the beach. "But you didn't," he pushed. "No," Nora agreed, looking back at him. "Because that weekend, you told me my teaching career was a cute hobby and that I should just quit because you were making enough money for both of us. You didn't want a partner, Samuel. You wanted an employee. You wanted an audience. So I kept my mouth shut. I quit my job. I managed your household. I hosted your dinners. And I let you pay Apex Holdings." Samuel felt a cold, creeping numbness spreading through his chest. You kept it as leverage. I kept it as an insurance policy, she corrected. Against you. Samuel let out a breath that was half a laugh, half a choke. He ran a trembling hand through his damp hair. Fine, fine, you made your point. You're smarter than me. You played the long game. Bravo. He paced a tight circle in the small space, his mind reverting to its default state. Negotiation. Okay, how much? He asked, stopping to face her. You made your point. The divorce is final. You got your revenge. Now, let's do business. I'll buy the patent from you outright. I'll give you a 20% premium over market valuation. Hell, I'll give you a seat on the board. Name your price, Nora. I have to keep the factory running. Nora picked up her mug. The bergamot steam curled around her face. She took a slow sip. It's not for sale, Samuel. Everything is for sale, he snapped, stepping into her space, his shadow falling over her. Don't be stupid. You're sitting in a slum with a piece of paper worth $40 million. You can't manufacture the valves yourself. You need me. I don't need you, Nora said. She didn't flinch, didn't back away. She looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw a flash of raw, unfiltered contempt in her eyes. I don't want your money. I don't want a seat on your board. I don't want anything to do with the empire you built by hollowing out our life. Then what the hell are you going to do with it? He screamed, the sound tearing through the apartment. Nora set the mug down. I already signed the papers this morning. I licensed the patent in perpetuity. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The hissing of the radiator grew deafening. To who? Samuel whispered. MedTech, Nora said simply. The name hit him like a physical blow. MedTech, his largest competitor. The company he had spent a decade undercutting, outmaneuvering and despising. No, Samuel breathed, staggering back a step. His legs felt like they were made of water. You couldn't. They'll retrofit their entire cardiac line. They'll put me out of business in 6 months. They offered a very generous upfront sum, Nora continued, her voice devoid of malice, just a cold recitation of facts. Enough to buy a small farmhouse in Vermont. Enough to fully fund the linguistics research grant I abandoned 10 years ago. They'll manufacture the valves cheaper, and frankly, their corporate culture is much cleaner than yours. You killed my company out of spite, Samuel choked out, gripping the back of the second-hand sofa to keep from falling. No, Samuel, Nora said, turning away from him to face the window. She crossed her arms over the bulky gray sweater. I didn't kill your company. I pulled my foundation out from under a house that had no room for me. What happens to the walls now is entirely your problem. Samuel stood there, dripping wet, shivering in the stifling heat of the small apartment. He looked at the woman he had spent 15 years ignoring. He had thought she was fragile. He had thought she was empty. He had asked for a divorce to cut away the dead weight. He hadn't realized until this exact moment that she was the gravity holding his entire world together. And now, he was just floating in the dark, water pooled in the floorboards of the Porsche, soaking into the thick, custom-stitched mats. Samuel drove back to the city in absolute silence. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't turn on the heater. He just let the damp, freezing air bite into his skin, his hands locked on the steering wheel until his joints ached. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dark kitchen of his 6,000-square-foot house, nursing a glass of tap water because the scotch suddenly made him want to vomit. The smart home system obediently kept the temperature at a flawless 70 degrees, but the air felt thin, sterile, like the inside of a vacuum-sealed jar. He kept staring at the ceramic bowl by the door where his keys rested. It was just a bowl, just a house, just a pile of expensive, meaningless materials stacked on top of each other. By Tuesday, the bleeding started. News of the MedTech licensing deal broke in the industry trades before Samuel could even assemble his legal team. The headline was a sterile, corporate bullet to the head. MedTech secures exclusive rights to next-gen cardiovascular architecture. Caldwell Solutions sidelined. Samuel stood on the steel catwalk overlooking the factory floor. He gripped the painted yellow railing, the metal cold and unforgiving beneath his palms. Below him, the machines were still running, but the sound had changed. It was no longer the roar of an empire expanding. It was the desperate, frantic breathing of a dying animal. Greg walked up beside him. The CFO didn't have his tablet. He didn't have his usual stack of manila folders. He just had his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched. MedTech sent the cease and desist, Greg said. His voice was flat, devoid of its usual nervous energy. There was no panic left, just the dull, heavy resignation of a man reading a coroner's report. We have 14 days to clear the proprietary architecture from our servers and halt all physical production. Hospital purchasing departments are already calling. They're canceling the Q3 orders. MedTech is offering them a 30% discount to switch. Samuel swallowed. The taste of bile and stale coffee clung to the back of his teeth. What about the injunction? Arthur said we could file an injunction. Buy us some time. Arthur called an hour ago, Greg replied, staring down at the spinning drill bits of a CNC mill. No judge will grant it. Nora owns the patent free and clear. You signed the asset waiver. It's ironclad, Samuel. We have no legal standing to force a hold. If we keep manufacturing past the 14th, MedTech will sue us for willful infringement, and they will pierce the corporate veil to go after your personal assets. Samuel closed his eyes. The sharp, industrial smell of ozone and machine coolant, a scent he used to inhale like oxygen, suddenly turned his stomach. So that's it. We just turn off the lights. We liquidate, Greg corrected gently. We sell the raw titanium stock. We auction the machines. We pay out severance. We file Chapter 11 to protect the remaining capital, and we dissolve the entity. Greg turned his head, looking at Samuel with a mixture of pity and exhaustion. I'm resigning, Samuel. Effective Friday. I need to find a new job before the industry blacklists anyone associated with this mess. Samuel didn't argue. He didn't shout. The fight had been completely hollowed out of him, scooped out, and left on the floorboards of a dingy Ballard apartment. Okay, Greg, tell HR to draft your package. Over the next 2 weeks, Samuel watched his life's work undergo a systematic, agonizing autopsy. He was there on the final day of production. He stood on the floor as the foreman, a heavy-set man named Bill with grease permanently stained into the creases of his knuckles, walked down the line. Bill reached up and pulled the heavy red disconnect levers on the main electrical panels. Clunk. A high-pitched whine spooled down into silence. Clunk. Another machine died. Clunk, clunk, clunk. The silence that followed was suffocating. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a Sunday morning. It was the heavy, unnatural stillness of a graveyard. The ambient hum of the ventilation system seemed deafening now. Dust motes drifted lazily in the shafts of gray light, filtering through the high industrial windows, settling onto the dormant, million-dollar equipment. The smell of hot metal faded, replaced very quickly by the stale, metallic scent of stagnant cutting fluid and cold concrete. Samuel walked back to his glass-walled office. The movers had already taken the leather sofa and the mahogany credenza. Only his desk and chair remained. He sat down, the leather squeaking softly, a faint, pathetic echo of the sound he had made in Arthur's office when he laughed at his wife. He pulled open his bottom drawer. Inside, resting against a stack of blank letterhead, was a single, small object. It was a cheap, plastic-cased pen, blue ink, chewed at the cap. Nora had left it on the kitchen counter years ago, back when they lived in the duplex. He had scooped it up by accident one morning, tossed it in his briefcase, and it had somehow migrated to this drawer, surviving a decade of office upgrades. He picked it up. He rolled the cheap plastic between his fingers. He hated her. A hot, dark coil of pure venom twisted in his gut. He hated her for her patience. He hated her for her silence. He hated her for letting him build a castle in the sky, knowing she held the detonator to the foundational pillars. But beneath the hatred, buried under layers of bruised ego and financial ruin, was a terrifying, jagged sliver of respect. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown plates. She hadn't begged for his attention. She had simply assessed the reality of their marriage, calculated the variables, and executed a flawless, bloodless amputation. She had played the corporate game better than he ever had, using the very structures of power he worshipped to bury him. He had spent years treating her like a dependent, failing to realize he was sleeping next to an apex predator. Samuel tossed the chewed pen onto the bare desktop. It rattled against the wood. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked out of the office. He didn't look back at the factory floor. There was nothing left to see. Rain hammered against the frosted glass of the conference room window, distorting the Seattle skyline into a smear of gray and muted blue. 6 months had passed. The Caldwell Medical Solutions building was now a hollow shell, leased to a logistics company that used the pristine manufacturing floor to store cardboard boxes of cheap electronics. Samuel sat at a long, generic laminate table in a mid-tier bankruptcy firm downtown. It wasn't Arthur Mitchell's office. He couldn't afford Arthur's hourly rate anymore. Instead, he was flanked by a junior partner named Charles, a kid who looked barely out of law school, wearing a suit that was slightly too large in the shoulders. The room smelled of stale printer toner and cheap, acidic drip coffee. Across the table sat the liquidators, 2 men in gray suits mechanically flipping through stacks of bound documents. "This is the final schedule of assets," Charles said, sliding a thick packet across the laminate towards Samuel. The paper scraped harshly against the table. "Once you sign this, the corporate dissolution is legally binding. The remaining capital in the holding accounts will be distributed to the secured creditors by end of day. You'll retain your personal checking, the primary residence, and the vehicles, but the corporate entity ceases to exist." Samuel stared at the packet. He wore a simple charcoal suit today. No power tie, no expensive watch. The Rolex had been liquidated to cover a final payroll tax liability. His wrists felt oddly light, naked. He picked up the pen Charles offered him. It was a standard issue, black ballpoint. It felt light and flimsy in his grip. He leaned over the document, the dense blocks of legalese blurred together, a meaningless jumble of terms and conditions dictating the end of his professional identity. He flipped to the last page. A single black line waited for his signature. Samuel Caldwell, CEO, Caldwell Medical Solutions. He hesitated. The tip of the ballpoint hovered a fraction of an inch above the paper. For a brief, jarring second, his mind flashed back to the dingy apartment in Ballard. He remembered the smell of hot dust and bergamot tea. He remembered the bulky gray sweater, the messy hair, the absolute chilling calm in Nora's pale blue eyes. "I didn't kill your company. I pulled my foundation out from under a house that had no room for me." He had spent the last 6 months trying to convince himself she was a villain, a vindictive, spiteful woman who had destroyed an empire out of sheer jealousy. It was an easier narrative to swallow. It shifted the blame. It allowed him to be the martyr. But sitting in this sterile room, inhaling the scent of cheap toner, the lie finally fractured. He hadn't built an empire. He had built a vanity project on a rented plot of land. He had taken her money, her time, her silence, and her youth, and he had converted it all into titanium valves and glass offices. He had laughed when she asked for nothing, too blind to realize she was already holding everything that mattered. Samuel pressed the pen to the paper. He didn't use the aggressive, sweeping flourish he had cultivated over a decade of signing multi-million-dollar contracts. His hand moved slowly, mechanically. The ink scratched against the cheap paper, a thin, quiet sound in the empty room. He signed his name. He put the pen down. It didn't clink against crystal. It just rolled slightly on the laminate and stopped. "All right," Charles said, pulling the packet back. The kid sounded relieved. "That's it then. We'll file this with the clerk before noon." The liquidators stood, snapping their briefcases shut. Hands were shaken. Polite, empty condolences were murmured. Samuel stood up, his legs feeling heavy, grounded by a crushing, inescapable gravity. He walked out of the conference room, down the narrow, beige-carpeted hallway, and into the elevator. The doors slid shut, cutting off the view of the law office. He was a wealthy man. He still had the house. He still had millions in personal liquid assets. He would never starve. He would never have to live in a walk-up that smelled of boiled onions. But as the elevator descended, dropping smoothly toward the street level, Samuel knew the truth. The bank accounts didn't matter. The house in Seattle didn't matter. He was entirely, utterly bankrupt. He stepped out into the damp, cold Seattle air. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and black. He pulled his coat collar up against the chill, put his hands in his pockets, and started walking. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew that for the first time in 10 years, there was no factory waiting for him, no empire to manage, no one to impress. There was just the wet concrete, the gray sky, and the quiet, echoing ghost of a woman who had finally stopped paying his rent. If you felt the raw tension of Samuel's downfall and Nora's chilling revenge, hit that like button right now. Stories like this take hours to craft, and your support keeps this channel alive. Drop a comment below. Was Nora justified, or did she go too far? Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and make sure you subscribe for more grounded, emotional storytelling every week.